Now, at long last, we seem to have a final word from Kathleen Kennedy herself on the status of the Boba Fett anthology movie. And that word, according to journalist Eric Weber, who personally asked Kennedy about the Fett movie at a recent event, is that the project is 100% dead, and 100% focus is now being moved to the upcoming series The Mandalorian, which will be on Disney's new upcoming streaming service. And to be honest, this news doesn't surprise me all that much in the wake of the box office failure of Solo, a movie I very much enjoyed but ended up losing money for Disney and Lucasfilm. I also think most of us assumed the Fett project was as good as dead after Bob Iger, CEO of Disney, said about a month ago that there's basically going to be a slowdown coming in regards to Star Wars movies, which I think was his way of saying that Solo flopping surprised them, and they don't really know what to do with this franchise right now, so they're going to take it slow, reassess, and come up with a game plan. Which is a good approach, because they shouldn't just blaze ahead without any sort of solid and well mapped out game plan, which many will argue has been the problem with the sequel trilogy, that they didn't have any sort of concrete outline ahead of time, that maybe it's not a good idea to let each writer come in and just do their own thing when you're trying to tell one cohesive story, which they admitted is the case with Rian Johnson and The Last Jedi. He was given free rein to do whatever he wanted with the story J.J. Abrams had started. Which seems like a really odd decision, again, when you're trying to tell one cohesive story. I mean, imagine where the MCU would be today, or if it'd be anywhere at all, if that had been their approach, if they just let each writer and or director do whatever they wanted with each individual movie. Would Infinity War have been one of the most successful and most beloved movies in recent history if there hadn't been a game plan in place from the start? What if there hadn't been a Kevin Feige overseeing it all and guiding the overall story to make sure each piece fit properly? And those, in my opinion, are the problems with Star Wars right now. No one's captaining the ship with the love and care of a Kevin Feige, and there's just no sort of overall plan. Instead of announcing upcoming projects, they tend to announce that they've hired writers and directors to make something that they'll figure out at a later date. Like when they announced shortly before Episode 8 came out that Rian Johnson was going to be making a new trilogy and taking us to a new part of the Star Wars galaxy we'd never been to before. And they basically did the same thing when they announced that Benioff and Weiss, of Game of Thrones fame, were also going to be making a series of Star Wars movies about something. And I'm sorry, but that approach doesn't instill a great deal of confidence in me, not when compared to the way Marvel makes announcements and shows you what movies will be in the next phase years in advance and before they've even 100% decided who's going to be responsible for making them. In other words, they have a vision and a story in mind ahead of time, a grand plan, if you will. Then they go out and look for writers, directors, and actors who can make it happen. They don't just hire people and hope they'll be able to deliver something good. I mean, from the outside looking in, it seems like they came up with this idea for anthology movies, or Star Wars stories as they ended up being called. Then they made two of them and had one that did really well, that being of course Rogue One, and one that didn't do so well, that being Solo. And then they decided to scrap the whole concept, which leads me to believe they, and by they I mean the top dogs at Disney and Lucasfilm, thought all they had to do to make a successful Star Wars movie is to make it about a beloved character, like Han Solo, or to put Darth Vader in the trailer like they did with Rogue One, and people would flock to see it. And though that seemed to work with Rogue One, which did extremely well at the box office, let's not forget that movie had the advantage of being only the second Star Wars movie back after a 10-year hiatus, meaning the excitement was still very much alive and well when it came out, just a year after The Force Awakens, which in general was a movie enjoyed by fans and average moviegoers alike. Solo, however, was the fourth Star Wars movie to come out in roughly 2.5 years, which means some of the excitement of Star Wars being back had now worn off, not to mention The Last Jedi was, shall we say, not well received by all fans, and it was the movie Solo had to follow. And though a boycott of Solo by some fans that were angry over The Last Jedi certainly played a part in its poor performance, it alone doesn't explain the dreadful numbers of Solo at the box office, relatively speaking, of course. Because Solo did make $390 million worldwide, which sounds great, till you realize it still lost somewhere in the neighborhood of $80 million. And when compared to the three previous Star Wars movies, all of which made over $1 billion, with The Force Awakens making over $2 billion, Solo's failure sounds even worse. And it had to leave Disney and Lucasfilm execs scratching their heads and wondering how such a popular character could lead to such a dud of a movie. Because when they greenlit Solo and put it into production, they likely thought that name alone would make it a hit, that of course Star Wars fans would want to see Han's backstory, but in reality, many people either already read about it in the expanded universe, or were happy with it being a mystery, and with his story starting in a cantina on Tatooine. And because of this failure, because one of the biggest character names in all of Star Wars didn't equal financial success, it no doubt felt like an obvious choice for Disney and Lucasfilm to cancel other character-based movies like Boba Fett and Obi-Wan. And the real problem or concern for them right now is they only have one sequel trilogy movie left to really bank on. Because yes, let's face it, Episode 9 is likely going to do very well at the box office. They've even told us they're going to advertise it as the end of the Skywalker saga, which, to be honest, it's a pretty good marketing tactic, and will likely put a lot of butts in the seats at local theaters, and will keep them coming back if the movie does manage to deliver and be good. And Episode 9 really does have to deliver, because if it doesn't, people won't be turning out for whatever else they finally come up with to come out next. Especially when you consider we've been told that next movie, after Episode 9, is going to take us to a new and different corner of the Star Wars galaxy, which might sound exciting to some fans, but likely won't resonate with the more casual fan or average moviegoer if they haven't enjoyed the end of the very familiar and well-known Skywalker saga. In other words, if people don't feel like they can get the part of Star Wars that everyone has always loved and enjoyed right, which is of course the Skywalker saga, why would they be confident that they'll get something completely new right? Why are people going to pay to see a movie that doesn't have any familiar places or faces in it and might not even look or feel like Star Wars to them? And of course, the scary part for Disney and Lucasfilm is that people also didn't pay to see a familiar name, though slightly different face, in the movie Solo. And then there's another problem that I think hardcore fans tend not to think about, that being that not all casual Star Wars fans or average moviegoers are overly familiar with the Star Wars timeline. For example, though I and likely you watching this had no problem understanding that Rogue One took place in the days leading up to A New Hope, there were many people that were utterly confused by that movie. A lot of people thought it was going to take place after the events of The Force Awakens, since it came out after that movie. And that's a huge advantage the MCU has over Star Wars. Their movies pretty much come out in a linear fashion. In other words, the next movie that comes out usually takes place after the previous one that came out in the timeline. And if it doesn't, that's usually pretty easy to figure out, like with Ant-Man and the Wasp. It's pretty clear that movie has to take place after Civil War and before Infinity War. Captain Marvel will also be taking place in the past, which will be pretty obvious and telling to everyone since the setting for the film will be the 90s. So the question for Star Wars becomes, what happens if, a couple years after Episode 9, when the first film written by Benioff and Weiss comes out, or Rian Johnson's, assuming his trilogy does still get made, and this new movie is in a new corner of the galaxy with all new characters, and it just doesn't do very well with either fans or average moviegoers? What's going to be the plan then? Keep going with that series and hope people will warm up to it? Or do you go back to anthology movies and hope you have a hit with either characters like Obi-Wan or Boba Fett? Or maybe you resurrect the Skywalker saga earlier than you wanted to because, let's be honest here, someday they're going to make an Episode 10, and there's just no way you don't reap that cash cow someday. But the longer you hold off on doing that, the more you'll likely make when you finally do cash in on the Episode 10 name. And look, I'm not trying to predict doom and gloom here, and I know many of you out there will counter by saying Star Wars is doing just fine. Relax though, you're only going to get people worked up for no reason. But even if you're someone who's been happy with all things Star Wars under Disney, maybe you should be a little worked up and concerned, and not so quick to overlook the failure of Solo. Because clearly Disney and Lucasfilm aren't overlooking it if they're dialing things back a bit and officially killing the Boba Fett movie. And honestly, I was surprised at just how poorly Solo did. I thought the name Solo would be worth a couple $100 million more in ticket sales. And again, if Star Wars can't bank on some of its biggest characters, why should we believe brand new ones in new settings are going to get better results? The simple truth here is that Lucasfilm and Disney just don't seem to know what they're doing with this franchise right now, or if they do, they're just not giving off that impression. And if there isn't any sort of major announcement concerning the future of movies at Star Wars Celebration this April, which yes is now less than 6 months away, that'll be a very telling and troubling sign. It'll show they really have no idea what to do, and are in a holding pattern until after Episode 9, and are probably betting on Benioff and Weiss, or maybe even Rian Johnson, to come up with and decide the future of Star Wars. Well, that's all I've got for you this time. Now it's your turn to tell me why you think Boba Fett was cancelled, and what will or should be the future of Star Wars after the sequel trilogy is done. So leave your comments below and let's talk some Star Wars. And until next time, thanks for watching.